Welcome back. This is a sermon for the 21st Sunday of Pentecost, and I'm using two readings in particular, one from the lectionary and one a poem by Mary Oliver entitled One or Two Things, and I want to read that to you. But also Matthew 22, 15 through 22, which is the story about him arguing with Pharisees about taxes and is it right to pay taxes? So we'll get into that in a minute. First, one or two things by Mary Oliver. Don't bother me, I've just been born. The butterfly's loping flight carries it through the country of the leaves delicately and well enough they get it where it wants to go, wherever that is, stopping here and there to fuzzle the damp throats of flowers in the black mud. Up and down it swings, frenzied and aimless, and sometimes, for long delicious moments, it is perfectly lazy, riding motionless in the breeze on the soft stalk of some ordinary flower. The god of dirt came up to me many times and said so many wise and delectable things. I lay on the grass listening to his dog voice, crow voice, frog voice. Now, he said, and now, and never once mentioned forever, which has nevertheless always been like a sharp iron hoof at the center of my mind. One or two things are all you need to travel over the blue pond, over the deep roughage of the trees, and through the stiff flowers of lightning, some deep memory of pleasure, some cutting knowledge of pain. But to lift the hoof, for that you need an idea. For years and years I struggled just to love my life, and then the butterfly rose weightless in the wind. Don't love your life too much, it said, and vanished into the world. Thank you, Mary Oliver. So I want to start with that image in Mary Oliver's poem that I find so compelling, which is in such even wonderful spiritual wisdom. And then I'll get to the gospel and maybe find some wisdom there also. So what I take away from one or two things is how the god of dirt mentions many things, but never immortality. But for Mary Oliver, and many, if not all of us, the fact that we are and everything, the fact that we and everything else is not forever, is a hoof at the center of our foreheads. And what an arresting image that is. I see and I feel a horse's hoof smack on my forehead. But to lift the hoof, she writes, for that you need an idea. Of course, the butterfly weightless in the wind, or out here, a seagull hovering over the lake, struggling to fly forward but pushed backwards by the wind. They don't need an idea. They don't have that hoof on the forehead, but we do. And the idea Mary Oliver offers is not love, is to not love our lives too much, which sounds a lot like Jesus, who warned us not to lose our lives by holding on to them too tight. It is a confounding wisdom that hovers like the gull at the center of our spiritual tradition. It is the idea we need to lift the hoof that sometimes rests so heavily on our foreheads. Now let me wander away from the hoof on our foreheads for a moment and see if Jesus has something just as juicy for us. It is easy to listen to that gospel argument about paying taxes and focus on the wrong thing. In all fairness, Taxes seem like the issue, especially just after paying our school tax here. It was an issue, all right, in Jesus' day, but it's not the punchline of the wisdom teaching he offers. Jesus, who we claim is uniquely marked by God, is thrown into a first century hornet's nest about taxes. To understand the bind that he was in, we need to know the characters in question. In the gospel story, the Herodians represent religious figures who served at the whim of civil authority and who financially and socially benefited from the Roman occupation. Think Vichy France. The Pharisees represented a popular movement within the religion which was at tension with civil authority. That was because the Pharisees believed that the Roman requirement to pay taxes amounted to coerced blasphemy. Since Rome claimed that Caesar was a god, paying taxes amounted to idolatry. Now, unmentioned in this story, but fully present between the lines, are the Zealots, some of whom were insurrectionists. They believed that payment of taxes amounted to willful participation in evil. So when Jesus is asked the question of whether it is right to pay taxes or not, it's really a cruel trick, a malicious strategy aimed to actually endanger him and discredit him. Here's what I mean. For him to say, yes, it's okay to pay taxes, would discredit him with the majority of his peers, all of whom were overburdened by Roman taxes and temple taxes. A yes answer would also be met with criticism of his preaching by the Pharisees and with the wrath of the Zealots, who would then see him as an enemy. On the other hand, to say, no, don't pay taxes to Rome, was to be arrested for fostering treason and promoting insurrection. So standing between yes and no was to be squeezed between a rock and a hard place. There seemed no good answer, no room to move. But Jesus very cleverly gives a response rather than an answer. A response rather than an answer. And how many times do I look back in my life and wish I had given a response instead of an answer? You see, Jesus' response could be heard differently by different people. It all depended upon which perspective they were listening from. And we should remember that today. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's could be heard by both Romans and Zealots as the right answer. To the Romans, Caesar was God, and to the Zealots, everything belonged to their God. But Jesus penetrates the whole issue with one little word. Jesus wants to know whose icon is on that coin. Whose icon is on that coin? Undoubtedly, Jesus intentionally uses the same word icon as is in the creation story in the book of Genesis. It's the story where it says that we were created in the icon of God, or the image as we translate it so often today. At root, what Jesus is saying is that whatever image may appear on the coin, you and I are made with the icon of God upon us. Now that may not seem like a radical thing to say today, but imagine that idea in a world where slavery, the ownership of people, and military occupation, along with the ownership of lands and nations and people, was simply assumed. In that world, to say instead that we belong to God would be downright subversive. Now, money, our money, that is printed in the U.S. Mint, belongs to the United States of America. We just use the money in our pockets. We cannot own it. We just use it. But you and I, we belong to God. You and I have been imprinted with the image of God upon us. To reflect the image of God as best we know how, is basically what this whole thing is all about, this religion thing, this spiritual community thing that we do. We reflect God as best we can until we die. And then we become God in some way that we cannot now imagine. We are made in the image of God, and we belong to God. We don't belong to our family. We don't belong to our church. We don't belong to our ethnicity or race. We don't belong to our uniform or profession. We don't belong to our nation or state or party. We belong to God. We belong to God. And as soon as we lose that connection, or it seeps into forgetfulness, or we pretend it doesn't exist, that's the moment we no longer know whose we are and who we are. Nothing but God is forever. Nothing. The weight and shape of that hoof on our forehead will only be lifted by the knowledge of whose we are and who we are in the image of the forever one who created us. Our spiritual practice is all about knowing and showing who we are in the image of whose we are. We don't talk about this too much, our being an icon of God, but it is right there, smack dab at the center of this thing that we do called church or community. It is the center of our identity, this elemental, basic knowing who we are and in whose image we are created and have our being. How do you like that marriage of Mary Oliver and Jesus talking to us after all these years? The hoof on our forehead is lifted by the idea of our being an icon of the one who created us and who will receive us when we are no longer in the world of butterflies and gulls. Remembering whose we are and reflecting it by who we are is right there at the heart of Christian spirituality 101. I wish you peace, and I thank you for being part of this.